Will was an ugly, useless, and miserably poor child who had accidentally awakened legendary powers capable of erasing all human existence, yet he continued hiding his abilities to appear like an ordinary boy. One evening, as he returned alone to his apartment, he prepared a meal for himself, but before eating it, he fell asleep from exhaustion. When he opened his eyes again, he found himself facing a completely different feast. He looked at the plate, then at the reflection on its polished surface, and saw a face entirely unlike his own. He had manifested as a small child in another world, surrounded by musicians and cheerful crowds. At first, he thought he had simply traveled abroad, but he quickly noticed that everyone around him was speaking Japanese. This made him assume he was dreaming, yet the dream felt too real, especially when he tasted the food as soon as he touched it. He closed his eyes, trying to wake up, but a voice called out, urging him to stand. An elderly man woke him and told him to introduce himself to the guests. The man led him toward a group of people and urged him to speak. Will, now known as Shingo, felt terrified as all the adults stared at him. At that moment, a slightly older boy named Eric stepped in and introduced him as his younger brother, explaining that his full name was too long and that everyone simply called him Will. Eric then sat beside him and asked why he had been so distracted earlier. When Will failed to answer, Eric explained that since he was only 5 years old, he would clarify everything for him. Today is our older brother Kurt's wedding. He married Amelie, the second daughter of the nobleman Maine. Their father had struggled to find a bride for Kurt, so he was delighted when a noble's daughter accepted the proposal. That was when Will realized that this family also belonged to the noble class. Later that evening, people drank and applauded while Will still struggled to adjust to his new body and the entire bizarre situation. However, he felt relieved that he could understand the language and even read the signs. Judging from the celebration, he assumed the family was wealthy, and since he was the third son, he thought he wouldn't need to worry about work or food, so he simply picked up his fork and continued eating as if nothing were unusual. But his joy didn't last. The following morning, Will was shocked to see how terrible the breakfast was. Nothing but dry, stale bread and a small bowl of watery, unpleasant soup. What disturbed him even more was that his family ate it as if it were normal. Looking around, he noticed peeling wallpaper and a worn, nailed-together wooden table. When Eric returned from a hunting trip, Will asked in confusion, "Didn't you host a huge celebration yesterday? Why do we look this poor now?" Eric explained that they couldn't appear miserable in front of the wedding guests and had to display a respectable image. In truth, they were extremely poor, covering the cracked walls with curtains and serving fine food only for the wedding night. Everything had now returned to their usual routine of stale bread and watery soup. Will, still overwhelmed, assumed that being the third son of a noble family meant he would at least inherit a small plot of land. But another surprise came when Eric greeted a brother named Helmut. Moments later, 2 more young men arrived, his brothers Paul and Herman. Eric added that 2 additional brothers had not attended the wedding. At that moment, Will realized the truth of his situation. Not only was his family poor, but he was the 8th son of this destitute noble household. Despite their circumstances, his parents seemed to enjoy their time together in their room. Will began trying to understand where he now stood in this world. They lived in a kingdom called Helmut, whose capital was Start, home to nearly 1 million people. Far to the south lay the Bleischer Duchy, and farther still was the rural region they lived in, the land of the Balmanites, a countryside area with only about 800 residents, and he, Will, was the 8th son of that impoverished noble family. Feeling suffocated by the limitations of his new life, Will noticed 3 of his brothers saying their farewells to their mother. He hurried toward them to ask what was happening. Eric explained that they were leaving. The land would not be divided among them. Their elder brother Kurt would inherit everything, while Herman would marry into a branch family. The remaining brothers would have to start from nothing in the capital, and would no longer retain the status of nobles. Eric advised Will to pursue his education, as it was the only thing that could help him. Then he departed, leaving Will heartbroken as he said goodbye to his brothers. Will went straight to the family library to prepare for his uncertain future, but all he found were poetry books and romantic novels. As he returned one book to its shelf, he accidentally knocked down a box from above. Inside were a sheet of paper and a crystal orb. The paper explained that the orb was a magical test stone used to measure a person's ability to use magic. Will nearly dismissed it, believing magic wasn't real, until he remembered he now lived in a different world. Reading further, he learned that only 1 in 1,000 people possessed enough mana to cast spells. His hope diminished, but he continued reading. The paper stated that magical talent wasn't hereditary, and anyone could potentially possess it. The orb was simply the tool for revealing it. Unconvinced that he would be that lucky, Will still decided to try. He placed the orb on the desk and attempted to pour mana into it. As expected, nothing happened at first. He wasn't disappointed, but then, suddenly, the orb shone with an intense white light. At that moment, a long-haired man deep in the forest sensed something unusual. Back in the manor, Will was still stunned by what he had witnessed. He grabbed the paper again, searching for an explanation. It said that if the orb glowed brightly, it meant the person possessed exceptional magical ability, and they should study magic under specialized instructors. Will searched the entire library for such books, but all he found were novels, travel stories, and poetry. There were no magic books at all. While he was still looking, his father entered the library to find him. Will asked whether they had more books, but his father admitted he couldn't read and explained that these were the only books they owned. Then he told Will to go to the forest and gather firewood. In the forest, Will attempted to cast magic using a tree branch, but nothing worked no matter how hard he tried. His frustration grew. Suddenly, he heard a voice calling out to him. It came from a long-haired man descending from the sky. The man seemed delighted to find him and asked for his name, but Will, frightened, tried to threaten him with the branch he carried. The man apologized for startling him and calmly took the branch from his hand, tossing it away. He then explained that he was a magician. However, the thrown branch fell off a cliff and struck a large rock, causing it to tumble downward. When Will and the man looked below, they saw that the rock had landed on a massive wild boar. The boar lifted the rock and glared at them, convinced they had tried to kill it. It charged toward them. Terrified, Will tried to run, but the magician grabbed his arm, preventing him from fleeing, and held out his hand toward the boar. He told Will to imagine wind magic. Though trembling, Will listened as the magician instructed him to visualize mana flowing through his body. Both of them glowed with a green light as mana gathered in Will's hand. As the boar charged closer and Will panicked, the spell finally formed, and a powerful burst of wind exploded from his hand, pushing the boar back. The attack only angered the creature further. This time the magician used his own magic and hurled it far away. Afterward, he introduced himself as Alfred Rainford, a former magician of the Bleischer Duchy. He told Will that he was gifted and that he would one day surpass him. When Will returned home, frustration lingered over their daily meals. Dinner was nothing more than light tea that tasted like plain water, unlike the delicious tea he had shared with Alfred. After their encounter with the boar, Alfred had sat with Will to drink tea and told him he wanted to teach him magic. Will was surprised by the offer and explained that he couldn't afford to pay him anything, but Alfred assured him that he didn't need money. All he wanted was a student. Before they began training, he warned Will to keep his magic a secret. If people learned of his talent, they might try to make him the next family leader instead of Kurt, which would cause complications in the line of succession. Will, being a child, didn't fully understand the issue. Alfred then explained how powerful magic truly was. Far beyond Will's imagination, Will immediately promised he would keep it hidden. The next day marked their first training session, focused on capacity matching. Will needed to match his mana capacity with someone who had more mana than he did. The two held each other's hands and began circulating mana through their bodies. Will was amazed by the strength of Alfred's mana, and Alfred congratulated him on succeeding. He had been worried that Will might not manage to match his capacity, since mana capacity was determined at birth, but Will not only matched Alfred's mana, he surpassed it, and still hadn't reached his limit. Will's talent far exceeded his own. Meanwhile at home, Will's father stared at the magic orb sitting on the family bookshelf, confused about why it had been moved. He remembered that Will had been here a few days earlier and laughed. Kurt laughed with him, convinced that Will had simply been disappointed after discovering he had no magical talent. But in reality, Will was in the middle of fire magic training. Alfred applauded him for learning such an advanced spell after only a few days of practice. Alfred had also brought a basket of vegetables from the mountain, so the family would think Will had simply gone to gather vegetables in the forest. That evening, the family praised Will for the amount he brought back, but Kurt felt uneasy and asked where he had found that specific type of vegetable. Their father realized that this plant grew on the opposite side of the river, where there was no bridge. Did this mean Will had flown across using magic? The father laughed at the idea, but Kurt began to suspect that Will truly possessed magical power. A few days later, Will and Alfred were flying high above the ground while Will practiced tracking magic. He felt the vibrations of the terrain below, and once he located his target, launched a wind-propelled stone that struck a bird. They cooked it and ate together. Will took out a bottle of hot sauce and offered it to Alfred, but Alfred didn't find it spicy at all. While they ate, Alfred warned him not to venture into the deeper parts of the forest. It held monsters far beyond his ability, as well as treasures and rare herbs, yet anyone who went in never returned. After eating, Will confessed to Alfred that he felt Kurt was watching him. Everywhere he went, Kurt followed. Alfred realized that Kurt had figured out Will possessed magic and feared for his position as the next leader. But Will had no desire to lead the family. He saw it as nothing but trouble and didn't want to cause conflict among his brothers. At the same time, he didn't know what he wanted to do with his life. Alfred suggested becoming an adventurer. The idea appealed to Will, and he began to think about his future. Suddenly, a demonic aura appeared on Alfred's arm. He immediately grabbed his arm and hid it from Will, forcing the aura back inside with difficulty. He knew the time hadn't come yet. At dinner, Will announced to his family that he intended to become an adventurer. His older brother was happy because it meant Will would leave, but their father said they didn't have the money to enroll him in the Adventurer Academy. During the next training, Alfred showed Will the city where the academy was located. Brush, a commercial city where many people joined the merchant guilds. Will realized he could earn money and sell goods there, but first, he needed to learn how to travel. The method was teleportation magic, specifically, flight magic. Alfred grabbed Will by the arms and lifted him into the sky. At first, Will screamed like a child until Alfred slowed down. When they reached the top, Will was amazed by the breathtaking view of the vast world he now lived in. That night, Alfred faced the curse attacking him once again. The next day, Will trained in flight magic. Alfred told him this would be their final session. Will begged him not to leave since they had only trained for 2 weeks, but Alfred silenced him and told him the decision was final. During dinner, their father mentioned that a whisperer of the dead had appeared in the forest. He explained that it was a walking corpse that resembled a human and could speak, but was dead and felt nothing. After a few years, such a creature would turn into a mindless zombie. Will then remembered that Alfred's body had felt cold, and that he could eat the spicy sauce without reacting. Fear struck Will, and he flew into the dark forest looking for him. He fell several times because of the darkness but eventually reached him. Will warned him about the undead creature in the forest and tried to pull him away, but Alfred confessed that he himself was the whisperer of the dead. He told Will that 5 years ago he had accompanied the Duke in search of medicine for his sick son. They were attacked by an army of monsters. Alfred fought to protect the Duke, but the monsters were too many, and eventually his mana ran out. Because he held deep regret and a strong final wish, he transformed into a walking corpse. That final wish was to pass on his magical knowledge to someone. When Alfred realized that Will had found him, overwhelming relief washed over him. He could finally rest. Only one test remained for Will, to purify him with holy magic. Will refused at first, but Alfred showed him how death was rapidly spreading through his body, and that he would soon lose consciousness and become a mindless zombie. He began teaching Will light magic, and as Will recited the incantation, the black aura surrounding Alfred began to burn. Alfred screamed in pain, yet continued encouraging him to proceed. Tears flowed down Will's cheeks. He didn't want to say goodbye to his teacher, but Alfred told him to remember everything he had taught him. Will recalled all of his lessons, bowed, and thanked him before finally releasing him from his suffering as a walking corpse. Alfred let out a faint laugh as he slowly faded into the light, advising him to live his life. Will wiped his tears, overwhelmed with grief, and promised to honor his teacher's final words. Years later, Will said farewell to his mother and left home to pursue his dream of becoming an adventurer. The Adventurer Academy was bustling with trainee students. In one of the classrooms, the new students introduced themselves. A blue-haired girl introduced herself as Louise, and another girl named Ina followed. After Will gave his introduction, the instructor handed out forms for them to fill in. This was the students' worst nightmare, especially for Will, because the form required them to create teams for group work. At dinner, Will sat alone, with no one beside him. Nearby, Louise and Ina were sitting together. They quickly realized that Will was the only scholarship student in their class. Another student, Erwin, said that Will's magical power was so high that even the instructor admitted he couldn't teach him anything. He added that anyone who joined Will's team would have an easy life at the academy, which was why everyone kept their distance. But Erwin had a plan. He believed Will was alone, because he was still evaluating the students. So, if they all challenged him, Erwin as the best swordsman, Louise as the strongest fighter, and Ina as the top lancer, they might convince him to join their team. Meanwhile, Will had no idea what they were thinking. He decided to befriend them and offered them some spices he had brought with him. But before he could continue, a group of students entered and announced that Will would be joining their Axe Trio team and no one else's. Will didn't even understand what they were talking about. Feeling jealous of how close everyone seemed, he quietly returned to his seat. In the next lesson, the instructors assigned them to go hunting. Will was excited to form a team, but found that everyone had already joined groups. At another table, Louise asked whether they should invite him, but Erwin refused. He believed Will choosing to be alone was a challenge to them, meaning they had to hunt more than he did to reach his level. Hours later, the students presented their hunts to the instructor. Erwin's team proudly delivered 3 full boars. When Will entered, he opened the magic pouch he had received from Alfred and began pulling out animal after animal until the entire table was covered. After witnessing his strength, the Axe Trio gave up on recruiting him and the students left the hall. Will, unintentionally overwhelming everyone, received money for his hunt. He wanted to invite everyone to dinner, but when he turned around, no one was left. That night, Erwin told the girls about his life, which turned out to resemble theirs. Since they were not the eldest in their families, they were always treated as unimportant. Worse, when their talents awakened, they became stronger than their relatives. Their parents and siblings avoided them out of embarrassment. They felt their dreams slipping away because of their birth order, so they swore not to give up and promised to make Will acknowledge them and their abilities. The next day, Erwin, Louise, and Ina entered the deep forest. They were quickly ambushed by numerous wolves. Fortunately, Will happened to be nearby, hunting. He sensed them through tracking magic and thought that saving them might help him make friends. He rushed toward the scene. Erwin, Louise, and Ina fought desperately, but the number of wolves was overwhelming. Erwin was injured, and even more wolves appeared, until Will arrived. With a single spell, rocks surged up from the ground, forming a barrier that prevented anything from reaching them. After the incident, they apologized to Will, explaining that they only wanted him to acknowledge them and their abilities. Will was confused, but they admitted that the spell he used was of S rank, a level far beyond anything they could reach. Because of that, they decided to abandon the idea of forming a team with him. Will nearly stopped them, but the instructor entered cheerfully and announced that the Duke had invited them all to a banquet. The entire class began discussing the prestigious invitation, but someone commented that they were surely invited because the Duke wanted to meet their great classmate Will. Upon hearing that, Will felt uncomfortable with how little they thought of themselves. The only people who didn't react much were Erwin, Louise, and Ina, who were too focused on thinking about what they were going to wear. At the banquet, it became clear that their classmate was right. The Duke entered the hall ignoring everyone else and walked straight toward Will. He introduced himself as Amadeus, greeted Will, and invited him to a private meeting, but Will shocked everyone by inviting Louise, Ina, and Erwin to join him, declaring publicly that they were his team members. At Duke Amadeus's palace, the Duke introduced Will to his royal magician Bran, who had also been Alfred's teacher in the past. Bran explained that 7 years ago he had sensed Alfred's presence disappear. Since Alfred was a walking corpse, Bran assumed he had fulfilled his final wish and found a student. Noticing that Will came from the same region where Alfred died and that he possessed Alfred's magic pouch, Bran asked, "Are you Alfred's student?" Will admitted it. When Bran asked how Alfred died, Will told him he had purified him with holy magic. Bran felt sorry that a child had been the one to release his teacher, but thanked Will for finally granting Alfred peace. Afterwards, Will returned everything inside the pouch, which turned out to be the Duke's old military supplies that Alfred had taken when he entered the forest years ago. After the meeting, Ina and the others discussed what they had heard. They felt ashamed for misjudging Will. They realized that he was just like them, an overlooked younger child of a noble family. When Will joined them, they apologized and admitted that they had planned to use his power to improve their own lives if he joined their team. Will laughed and admitted that he had also been using them. He simply didn't want to sit alone with a scary Duke, so he dragged them along. Then he added that he genuinely wanted to form a team with them. They all laughed and accepted him wholeheartedly. Suddenly the Duke entered and told Will that he would receive a reward for returning Alfred's belongings. The reward was 1,000 gold coins, and in addition, he would inherit all of Alfred's property. That night, Will ate in his new mansion. The place was so large that he felt lonely again. He wondered, could my friends live with me? Sometime later, Will and his friends were traveling on a magical airship toward the capital to attend Eric's wedding. Louise was overly excited and wore an extravagant outfit to attract attention. The Brat family, whom Eric was marrying into, included many influential figures. Erwin held tightly onto a pole. Terrified of falling off the ship, Bran, serving as their guide, reassured him that the airship could never fall. But suddenly, the clouds darkened, and a massive bone dragon appeared. Many passengers nearly lost control from fear and screamed at the crew. The crew tried calming them by reminding them that they had the great magician Bran on board. But in truth, Bran, inside the control room, refused to fight. He didn't know how to defeat an undead dragon because he couldn't use holy magic, but he knew someone who could. His eyes turned to Will. Will tried to decline, but Bran assured him he would succeed, just as Alfred had. Using flight magic, Will launched himself toward the dragon. The creature exhaled a black mist, but Will erected a barrier at the last moment. The ship was protected by a large barrier created by Bran. Will began casting holy spells, catching the dragon's attention. It lunged at him, but Will dodged skillfully, using flight magic. Eventually, he completed the incantation and struck the dragon with holy light. The dragon tried retaliating, but Will's spell destroyed its breath attack and damaged its body. As it neared death, the dragon refused to die alone. It launched a final desperate attack. Will created a protective barrier around himself, and moments later the dragon collapsed, its bones scattering. He gathered the bones into his magic pouch, and among them he found a dragon gem. A grand celebration erupted among the passengers afterward. Bran then introduced them to one of his old teammates, Ortio, who had become a merchant. The next day, everyone was severely hungover from the wild celebration, except Will and his friends, who stared ahead at the capital awaiting them. When they arrived, Bran immediately abandoned them and fled, leaving them in the care of the merchant Ortio. At that moment, the king's knights approached. They thanked Will for slaying the dragon and requested that he come to the castle. His friends left him at the gate, saying they would head to Eric's home ahead of him. Will entered with Ortio to meet the king. During the meeting, the king granted Will the title of 6th rank baron as a reward for his bravery. At Eric's house, Bran and the others discussed Will's sudden promotion. Eric couldn't believe it. How could his younger brother outrank their father? The title even allowed Will to begin a new noble lineage. His friends feared that he might stop adventuring with them, but Bran reassured them that the title wouldn't restrict him. Meanwhile, at the castle, Will was already overwhelmed. Noblemen were arguing over the price of the dragon bones and the gem he brought. One wanted the price drastically lowered, while another insisted on raising it sky high. Then Hone, the priest, stepped in and rescued Will, telling the nobles that they must buy the items at a fair price and be done with it. During this, Ortio explained to Will that everyone there was trying to pull him to their side, from the merchant who wanted the items for a high price, to Hone, who hoped to recruit him into the church. After some time, Will was finally allowed to leave, but as soon as he stepped outside the castle, a man began screaming at him and waving a spear. Ortio explained that this was most likely a knight wanting to become one of Will's retainers. Luckily, the guards quickly arrested the man and removed him. At Eric's wedding, Will noticed that his older brothers looked worried. They still hadn't prepared the family's wedding gift, and this would make them appear tasteless in front of the other nobles. Their eldest brother, Kurt, had sent a message saying there was no money. Even worse, this would damage the reputation of the duchy their family served. People might think the Duke Amadeus had refused to help them, since nobles were expected to support their vassals, but their father's pride prevented him from asking for assistance. When Will saw their anxious faces, he immediately declared that he would pay for the wedding gift himself. Eric's wedding proceeded successfully, and Will clapped joyfully, but deep down, he realized that being a noble would be far more exhausting than he expected. After the ceremony, Ortio handed Will a jar containing the item he had been searching for in the city, a jar of soybeans. Will transported himself and his friends to his new mansion. They spent the entire night cooking the soybeans, with Will using magic to speed up the fermentation. All of this was to prepare a delicious soup. Once finished, they sat together, Will, his friends and his family, enjoying the meal he made, and with that, Will quietly promised himself that he would become the best noble he could ever be. Afterward, Will went to be baptized by Hone, thanking him for his great help and offering him a generous gift. At that moment, someone knocked and entered with tea. Will trembled the moment he saw the girl carrying the tray. She introduced herself as Elise, Hone's granddaughter. The moment Will stood to introduce himself, he sensed something unusual about Elise. He realized she possessed magical power. Hone confirmed it and revealed that Elise had holy healing magic, a remarkable ability since Will himself only commanded holy purification magic. Elise helped heal the wounded at the church and had earned the title of saint. But the truth was that Holn wished for Elise to live a normal life and eventually marry. Since she came from a noble family, she had received many marriage proposals. Will joked that he would join the competition for her hand, but added that he was still far too young. Holn agreed that they could marry when they grew older. Will laughed and nodded. Yet it was a lonely laugh, for he suddenly found himself engaged to Elise from their very first meeting. Later, Holn sat in his garden sipping tea, discussing with his servant whether the engagement was right or wrong. He had already obtained the king's approval, meaning even Duke Amadeus, Will's superior, could not object. More importantly, they recognized the advantage of tying Will to their family. First, the gift he presented, a chest of gold, showed that Will understood the power of the church, and since their family held a viscount rank, marrying Elise to a young, talented baron like Will would be a significant gain for them. At his brother's home, Will informed his team about the engagement. They were all happy for him, except Will, who was the only one not pleased. He wished he had gotten to know the girl before being tied to her, but his friends explained that it was normal in their world to marry without knowing your partner. In fact, Eric himself hadn't met his wife until their wedding day, so they asked Will to close his eyes while they applied clown makeup on him. Disguised as a clown, Will was able to walk around the capital without anyone recognizing him as the Dragon Slayer. Erwin then told him to buy something for his future wife, which made Will wonder what Elise truly thought of all this. After finishing his shopping, he bumped into the same man who had tried earlier to become one of his retainers. Erwin reassured him that no one would recognize him in clown clothes, but the man identified him instantly from his teeth. Within moments, people gathered around and knights began begging Will to hire them. Meanwhile, the same man was showing off his spear skills, spinning it around wildly. Will immediately teleported away before chaos erupted. At home, Eric told him that the best solution was to choose a personal retainer immediately so he could reject all remaining requests. Erwin raised his hand excitedly and offered to become his retainer. Will agreed instantly. Erwin froze in shock, unable to believe he had been hired so easily. Will then took the gift he bought for Elise and left the castle. Erwin remained standing there, stunned. Using teleportation, Will entered the Holn family mansion without being seen, but Holn nearly caught him, forcing Will to hide. When Elise spotted him, he grabbed her hand and hid with her before her grandfather could see them. They slipped up to the rooftop, where Will pulled out the biscuits he had bought for her, though they had been crushed due to all the running around. He hid the biscuits behind his back and asked if they could talk for a moment. When he asked her about the engagement, Elise smiled and said she was happy. Her grandfather had chosen Will, and she was glad to marry the Dragon Slayer. At home, Erwin told Ina and Louise that he was now Will's official retainer. The two girls were annoyed. They had spent the whole day shopping for nothing. They began thinking about asking Will for appointments as well, but Erwin smirked and told them they would be working under him since he was the first retainer. When Eric and his wife entered, Erwin left with them. Louise then came up with a new idea, one that would put them above Erwin. They could become Will's concubines. When Will arrived, Louise tried seducing him with her new clothes and strange gestures, but Will understood nothing and walked past her. At night, Louise tore up her new clothes to make them more alluring. Encouraged by Ina, she admitted she was doing it in hopes that her family would finally acknowledge her when she married Will and opened her own dojo. Ina became equally determined. Meanwhile, Will received a dinner invitation from Elise. The next day, Will and Elise sat together for the meal. After eating, Will was about to leave, but Holn's servants approached and told him he should give Elise a gift to commemorate their first outing. So the two headed to a nearby jewelry shop. The shop was filled with rings and gemstones of various colors and shapes. To Will, they all looked cheap and unattractive. Elise gently told him he didn't need to choose something expensive, but Will assured her he had plenty of money, especially after the dragon-slaying reward. He noticed a simple ring in the corner. The shopkeeper suggested he pick something else, claiming it was too plain for an engagement, but Will saw the excitement in Elise's eyes and decided to buy it. It turned out to cost 6 times more than the other rings because it was made from a magical stone. After purchasing it, they returned by carriage. On the way, Elise asked if he realized the ring was made from a magic stone. The shopkeeper had said it could store large amounts of magical energy, so she assumed he bought it for that reason. But Will clarified that wasn't the case. He simply felt that it suited her. Will then admitted that his time in the capital had been stressful, mostly because everyone pressured him as the Dragon Slayer. At the same time, he admired Elise, who had spent her entire life enduring the pressure of being a saint. He then infused magic into the ring, illuminating the carriage with a red glow, and created an illusion of star-like light surrounding them. Will was amazed by the sight, while Elise stared at him, surprised by his honesty. That night, Hone asked his servant what he thought of Will. The servant said Will was hard to read, but noted one important thing: Will was the only person who treated Elise not as a saint, but simply as a normal girl. Erwin, Louise, and Ina were enjoying their time in the capital. Erwin asked the girls how their plan to win over Will was going, but they said they weren't in a hurry. Will was already occupied with Elise, so they decided to wait until he returned. Suddenly, Elise herself arrived. Thankfully, she hadn't heard anything they said. Erwin told her that Will had been summoned to the castle, but Elise had come specifically to meet them. She wanted to know what kind of person Will was from his friend's perspective. At the castle, the king requested that Will slay another dragon. Since Will served the king, he had no choice but to accept. The Knight Commander briefed Will and Bran on the situation. The capital was suffering from a food shortage, and they wanted to develop the nearby land. But that land belonged to an ancient dragon named Gregor. To defeat such a dragon, they needed powerful mages, so Will and Bran were summoned. Will wondered if they could truly defeat an ancient dragon, but the king assured him that someone else would join them. A man entered, greeted them, bowed before the king, and excitedly declared that the three of them would set out immediately to defeat the dragon. This was Arms, the palace mage. Despite his warrior-like appearance, he was in fact a very powerful magician. The three took flight together. Arms flew far ahead with such speed that Will was shocked. They were headed to the army's camp where they would finalize their strategy before the battle. At Eric's house, Eric told the others more details about Will's mission. Will wouldn't just be killing the dragon. Once the dragon died, the surrounding monsters might flood the villages. Will had to eliminate them as well. He was also authorized to form a temporary army. The group wondered why a major noble with an established army wasn't assigned to the task instead. Eric explained that it was a political issue. If a landowning noble handled the mission, he might later claim the land. But Will was a paper noble, one without territory, so he would only receive money and a medal. The land would remain under the royal family. At that moment, noise erupted outside the gates. Many knights had gathered, all wanting to become Will's subordinates, including the spear-waving young man. These were the troops who would form Will's temporary army. Erwin saw the crowd and felt sorry for whoever would lead them, but Eric explained that Erwin himself would be the commander. Since Will was on the mission, his retainer had to take his place. Erwin tried to refuse, but the others reassured him. Over the next few days, Erwin led the temporary army, made up entirely of younger sons of nobles or servants with no masters, all seeking glory to raise their social standing. At night, Erwin sat in his tent with the girls. Louise and Ina were finally beginning to feel afraid. It was their first battle. Fortunately, they would only be facing normal monsters. Will, on the other hand, had fought a skeletal dragon as his first enemy. Moments later, another figure arrived to join the campaign. It was Elise. Since she excelled in healing magic, she had come to help. She asked about Will, and Erwin explained that he had set up camp near the dragon's location, preparing to attack at dawn. When sunrise came, Will, Bran, and Arms stood above the dragon's territory, a massive pit filled with claw-like rocks. The green ancient dragon sensed them and awakened. The dragon roared, a signal for battle to begin. Arms used his magic instantly, transforming his body into a shield-like armor with a giant hammer. He leapt high into the sky toward the flying dragon and smashed its head downward. Will was stunned by Arms' strength. His magic converted raw mana into physical power, and his armor was far stronger than any normal magical barrier. When Arms slammed the dragon into the ground, Bran warned Will to get ready. Arms was holding the dragon down with all his might. Will wondered if they even needed him at all, but Bran explained that Arms' magic consumed mana rapidly. If it ran out, he would die. He had to pin the dragon down just long enough for Will to finish it. Arms gave the signal. Will cast his spell, and the dragon was defeated. Back in the army camp, Elise stood staring into the distance, thinking of Will. Erwin and the others brought her breakfast to comfort her, and introduced her to Will's favorite food, miso soup. Their conversation lifted her spirits until a soldier arrived with news. Will had already succeeded. He had slain the dragon. On the battlefield, Will stored the dragon's corpse in his magic pouch. The reward for this mission wasn't high, so they planned to sell the corpse. But Arms and Bran warned him that the hardest part wasn't done yet. Will didn't understand. What could be harder than killing a dragon? Bran reminded him that Alfred hadn't died from a powerful monster, but from being overwhelmed by sheer numbers. Hours later, Elise was in the camp healing injured soldiers. The monsters were so numerous that wounded men kept coming non-stop from the front lines. The soldiers said that the mages were the only reason they were still alive. Hearing that, Elise grew even more worried for Will, but she continued working. She healed throughout the night, until she was forced to use the magic stored in the ring Will had given her. Eventually she sat down to rest. The knight before her asked if she was truly engaged to the Dragon Slayer. She confirmed it, and asked if Will was alright on the front lines. He told her not only was he safe, he was the reason they were winning. He said heroes like Will were not like ordinary people. His words reminded Elise of her conversation with Will, who disliked the word hero because of the burden it carried. She felt sad knowing the sacrifices Will made, always trying to play the part for others. She promised herself she would stay by his side and fulfill her role as a saint. She healed as many as she could, and when her magic ran out completely, she asked another nurse for medical tools so she could continue treating the wounded without magic. Suddenly, a soldier rushed in reporting victory, but they needed a rescue team because someone had been injured. Elise panicked and ran toward the field, terrified for Will. She passed a group of soldiers and found that the injured man was one of Will's brothers, not Will himself. Then someone called her name. It was Will. He was unharmed and happy to see her. Upon seeing him safe, Elise relaxed, then collapsed from exhaustion. When she woke up, Will was sitting beside her. He told her he had heard rumors at the front lines about how she had healed every wounded soldier who returned, and how everyone managed to fight to the end thanks to the strength of the saint. Will stood to bring her water, but she held his hand and told him she now understood why he hated being called a hero. A moment later, Arms arrived and embraced Elise. Will was shocked to learn that Arms was actually Elise's uncle. A few days later, Will and his friends moved their belongings into a new house. Thanks to their recent achievements, they now lived permanently in the capital. Elise visited and brought miso soup, and Will welcomed her happily. She wanted to clarify something. Since Will lived with Louise and Ina, she thought he was engaged to them. Will quickly explained they were simply teammates who lived with him, but he used the moment to ask her opinion on concubines. Elise had no objection at all, just like everyone else he had asked before, and because of that, Will could no longer refuse when Louise and Ina once again offered to become his concubines. The next day, everyone went to attend another wedding, this time for Herman, Will's second brother, who had married and become a knight. Everyone around Will seemed to be advancing in life, especially him, as the entire kingdom kept its eyes on him. After the ceremony, an announcement was made regarding an upcoming grand tournament. Every noble was required to participate at least once. The available categories were swordsmanship, spearmanship, archery, and hand-to-hand combat. Since Will was a noble, people assumed he would enter the sword category. Will wondered if he could enhance his body with magic like Arms, but Eric informed him that magic was strictly forbidden in the tournament. Each morning, Louise, Ina, and Erwin ran together. Erwin always complained that the girls strengthened themselves with magic and wished he had enough mana to keep up. During their run, they looked up and saw Will casually flying above them. Later, Bran told the girls that Duke Amadeus had ordered them to participate in the tournament as well. They needed to prove that they were noble women in both name and skill. The girls immediately stopped running and began training without magic. Erwin meanwhile sat lazily on a couch, believing that even if he lost, nothing would change. But Bran warned him that if he continued like this, he would look like a burden and could be removed from the team. During dinner, Will announced that Ferran, the previous tournament champion, had stepped down to give others a chance to shine, meaning their odds of becoming famous had increased. Will then asked if Elise could join the team, and everyone agreed, since her healing magic was crucial. Erwin, however, panicked about being overshadowed and shouted that he would win the tournament no matter what. The next morning, Erwin ran at full speed and overtook the girls. Meanwhile, Will was nearly collapsing while running behind them. During weapon practice, Will struggled to control his sword. Later, while the others trained, Will had fallen asleep in bed from exhaustion. Erwin trained so hard that his hands bled, but he refused to stop. The girls began to think he might truly win. But then bad news arrived. The king had ordered Ferran to participate as a barrier for the younger nobles. Erwin was devastated and locked himself in his room. The girls tried to comfort him, insisting that losing was fine, but he snapped back, saying they couldn't understand his frustration frustration because they had magic while he didn't. Hurt by his words, the girls left him alone. In the morning, Erwin asked Will if he would be kicked from the team if he lost the tournament, but Will was still asleep. When he finally woke up, he admitted he was actually worried about Elise, who had never trained physically, and was scared to join the team. Hearing this made Erwin realize each of them had their own fears. He apologized to the girls and reconciled with them. On the day of the tournament, everyone headed to the arena. Elise arrived carrying a lunchbox for them to eat after the matches. Will's first match was a shock. He had been paired with Ferran, the previous champion. Will drew his sword. The bell rang, and Ferran instantly rushed forward, struck Will in the stomach with the pommel of his sword, and knocked him out in 1 second. After regaining consciousness, Will quietly returned to his seat and drank tea with his friends while watching the remaining matches. Erwin advanced steadily in the sword category. Ina progressed in spears. Louise advanced in hand-to-hand combat, but was stopped in the semi-finals. Bran praised her for reaching such a high rank despite her magic fist style being useless in a no-magic tournament. Ina reached the spear finals, where her opponent was the young man who had tried earlier to become Will's retainer. As soon as he saw her, he grew excited. Imagining Will might be watching, he launched forward quickly, thrusting repeatedly. Ina tried to counter, but he parried her strikes, then performed his signature move, spinning his spear until hers flew from her hands. She returned to the group and admitted she lost, saying her opponent, Rude, was incredibly strong. He came from a merchant family and was skilled in accounting and law as well, but Will wasn't listening at all. He was asleep from exhaustion because he had cooked all the food Elise brought. Meanwhile, Erwin won his semi-final match, but suffered a deep shoulder injury. His next opponent would be Ferran. The girls bandaged him while the officials urged him to forfeit, but Erwin had made up his mind. He would continue. The girls told him they knew Bran had pressured him with harsh words. Erwin admitted it was true, and that he feared becoming a burden. But the girls showed him the lunchbox Will had prepared, proof that Will would never throw anyone away. Erwin took a bite, stood up and declared that as a member of Will's team, retreat was not an option. A few days later, Erwin and Ina began training under Ferran. Louise, on the other hand, asked Will to train with her and her instructor. To Will's shock, her instructor turned out to be Arms himself. Will agreed to train with them and began the next phase of his journey. 3 years later, in the countryside, Will's family was still struggling to repair their farmland. Kurt was reviewing their tax documents when his wife entered to inform him that visitors from the capital had arrived. He found it strange for anyone to travel so far, but his expression shifted to irritation when he learned the matter involved his younger brother, Will. At the mansion, the visitor delivered a letter from the royal auditor. Kurt handed it to his wife dismissively, assuming it was another request to join Will's household. He told the visitor he didn't care how famous Will had become, but suddenly his wife screamed after reading the message. Will had died while exploring ancient ruins. A few days earlier, Will had finally become an officially registered adventurer, happy to be freed from noble duties. His first mission was a request from the king to investigate ancient ruins. Will's team entered the ruins with Bran as their guide. Bran explained that many adventurers had already been sent in, but none returned. Even elite adventurers sent to find them also disappeared. The guild suspected a dragon dwelling within the ruins, and no one was better suited than the dragon slayers, led by Will. As they advanced, Will scolded the team for hiding behind him. Erwin insisted that Will was the only one who had ever fought a dragon, and that a dragon's breath would kill them instantly. Before opening the door to the ruins, Bran used detection magic. Inside, they found nothing, no traces of the vanished adventurers. Suddenly, Bran sensed danger and yelled for them to run, but it was too late. The doors shut, a magic circle appeared beneath them, and their legs froze in place. Bran warned them to brace for anything. It was a trap set by an ancient magical civilization. One by one, each of them began to vanish. Elise tried to grab Will, but he disappeared the moment she reached for him, and seconds later, she vanished too. When they awoke, they found themselves in a completely different room, with a symbol on the wall labeled reverse suspension. Bran theorized that the teleportation had taken them to the deepest level of the ruins, leaving only one option: climb up to escape. Louise was not afraid, assuming Will could teleport them out. But Will explained that his teleportation required precise knowledge of both location and destination, something impossible now. Their only choice was to climb. They reached the next level. Elise held tightly onto Will, who smiled and reassured her. Entering another chamber, the door slammed shut, and golem guardians activated around them. Will prepared to cast a spell, but the others stopped him. They didn't know how many floors remained, so they had to conserve Will's mana. The three fought the golems themselves, while Bran and Will supported them with limited spells. After the fight, Elise healed their wounds. Ina noticed skeletons resting against the walls, and Bran assumed they belonged to the adventurers who disappeared before them. The next staircase was also filled with golems. The team fought again, and then again, floor after floor. Outside the ruins, 5 days had passed. The king-in-arms grew worried, and nobles whispered that Will was likely dead. In truth, many nobles were pleased at the idea. When the priest passed by, they expressed concern for his granddaughter, but he told them Will and Elise were still alive. Nearby, a noble named Rukner stood listening. Some nobles wondered who had spread the rumor of Will's death. The truth was that the rumor came from a noble seeking promotion to commissioner. He had even sent a message to Kurt announcing Will's death, hoping Will's title would pass to his children. Meanwhile, inside the ruins, the team was exhausted after 5 days of non-stop fighting. Still, Will tried to stay cheerful as he shared a meal with Elise. They only slept 2 hours at a time, constantly alternating between combat and rest. Floor after floor, they defeated every golem waiting for them. Their fatigue grew, and their injuries worsened. The next chamber was larger, filled with even more golems. Elise healed Erwin, who began to worry they would die here. She encouraged him, and Erwin vowed he couldn't die yet, not before defeating Ferran someday. His words strengthened her resolve. Before entering the next floor, Elise told Will they should escape, and that she would regret not marrying him sooner if they died. Her words encouraged him, and they continued. To their surprise, the next room was a massive empty space. No golems, but Bran stayed alert. In the distance, he spotted a huge statue. It slowly awakened, spread its wings. It was a golem dragon. Bran cast a barrier instantly, and within moments, the dragon attacked. Will reinforced the shield with magic, but golems burst out from side doors and attacked Ina. More golems continued pouring in, surrounding them from all directions. Will and Bran held off the dragon, while Erwin and Louise fought the approaching golems. Elise desperately healed Ina, burning through the last of her mana, even the mana stored in her magic ring. If the fight continued, Will and Bran would eventually run out of mana, and the dragon would kill them all. So Will made a decision. He would defeat the dragon himself. Bran doubted they could pierce the dragon's mithril-like body, but he chose to trust Will. He transferred the last of his mana to him. Will countered the dragon's breath attack with a powerful spell. Bran collapsed, happy to see Will, who reminded him of Alfred. Will faced the dragon alone. The dragon's power overwhelmed him. Will felt himself fading and apologized to his friends, but suddenly, Elise shouted that she would use the Miracle Light spell. In one swift motion, she kissed Will and collapsed. Will held her and felt his magic surge. His power exploded. He launched his attack with everything he had. The dragon fell. With the dragon's death, the remaining golems shut down, allowing the others to rescue Will and Elise, who had both fainted. Hours later, Will regained consciousness and found Louise and Ina discussing the fight. The Miracle Light spell replenished physical strength and, in rare cases, could restore mana, but it did not require a kiss, meaning Elise used the excuse deliberately, because she couldn't bear dying without kissing the man she loved. When Will and Elise woke up together, they joined Bran, who was inspecting their new surroundings. He realized the creator of this place was a famous ancient mage, known for crafting magical devices. The entire ruin was likely built as a test to see who was worthy of his inheritance. Erwin called them over with excitement. They had found something incredible. A massive shipyard with ancient airships. These airships were identical to the models their kingdom used as prototypes for modern designs. Then Erwin pressed a button. A wall shifted open, and at long last, they had found their escape from the ancient ruins. Because of their discovery of the 7 ancient airships inside the ruins, along with the magic stones that powered them, the golem beasts, and the research left behind, every member of Will's party was rewarded with 2 million gold coins. It was enough for them to never worry about money again. Afterward, Will informed Arms that they would be leaving the capital and focusing their adventures around the duchy. Arms promised to track down whoever had spread the rumor rumor of Will's death, which surprised Will as he had no idea what was going on while he was gone. It became clear that many nobles were jealous of Will's success and had begun spreading malicious rumors about him. Ina pointed out that nobles were also irritated by how close the party was to Will. Now that they each possessed 2 million gold coins, they would attract even more unwanted attention. To avoid this, they decided to use the guild system to reassign the reward money. Instead of each person keeping their 2 million, they chose to give the entire amount to Will, since Elise was Will's fiancée. She also offered him all her assets. In short, Will suddenly became richer by 10 million gold coins. Meanwhile, Rock, the noble who wished for Will's death, held a secret meeting with other nobles plotting against him. They agreed to combine their influence to eliminate Will. Outside Will's mansion, a hooded girl watched quietly as Will and his group sat inside eating biscuits. Will sensed movement near the window, but when he looked outside, no one was there. Still, he decided they needed a guard for the mansion once they left. With so many people resentful toward him, they needed someone strong and loyal. The group immediately suggested finally hiring Rude, the spear wielder. He had wanted to become Will's servant for 3 years, and when Will finally accepted, Rude burst into tears of joy. Will sensed movement again outside the window, but the girl disappeared before he could see her. Later that day, the girl attempted to spy again and saw them eating lunch, but this time the others felt her presence. Louise ran to the window and Erwin positioned himself between the window and Will. When they looked out, the spy had vanished. Rude vowed to catch her and advised Will to leave the capital as soon as possible, but Will said he still had something to do first. At that moment, the spy ran toward the city. In the afternoon, Will and his friends visited the Magic Guild, the organization studying the teleportation spell Will had discovered in the ancient ruins. The guildmaster, Lucas, welcomed them and showed them a new magic circle capable of summoning anything the caster imagined. Erwin joked that thieves would love such a device. Will tried it himself. He closed his eyes and focused on what he wanted. After a moment, an object appeared, but it was a witch's outfit. The witch who had been summoned smacked Will, who insisted he had been distracted by the conversation about thieves and did not intend to summon that. He tried again and succeeded. The burst of light was huge, suggesting he had summoned something very large. Later, the spy saw Will and his friends exiting the guild carrying a massive cart. She tried to follow, but Will used teleportation and returned home instantly. Meanwhile, outside Rock's estate, Rude spotted nobles boarding a carriage to continue their plot against Will and noticed Rock laughing from an upstairs window. The spy returned to Will's mansion. Looking through the window again, she saw Will hosting a large banquet. It was clearly a farewell party, thanking those who had supported him. Duke Amadeus, Arms, Bran, and even Priest Holm. Then Will brought out a huge platter filled with tuna sushi, the very object he had summoned from the guild's teleportation circle. The nobles were curious about how to eat the strange dish, so Will demonstrated how to dip it into soy sauce, something he had perfected over 3 years. Guests loved the taste, while the spy continued to watch from outside. At the same time, Rude informed Will that Rock was the one who spread rumors of his death in the ruins. Will was confused as he had never even spoken to Rock. Rude explained that Rock did it to damage Ruckner, Rock's own brother, who had a close connection with Will. Rock had also sent a messenger to Will's family, hoping Kurt would feel indebted to him, and that once Kurt's children inherited Will's title, Rock would gain influence. Fortunately, Rude revealed he had a plan to keep the royal auditor busy for days. In Rock's estate, he soon learned that rumors blaming him for spreading the news of Will's death had circulated through the entire capital and even reached the royal palace. He was summoned. This was part of Rude's counterattack, fighting lies with more lies. Rude also revealed a hidden truth. He was actually Rock's illegitimate son. Later, Elise arrived with more tuna for the group, but the spy outside could no longer contain herself. She burst into the mansion and walked toward Will with an unnerving aura. Erwin tried to stop her, but she threw him aside easily. She approached Will, and then stopped at the table and ate a piece of sushi. Lord Edgar, the kingdom's general, stepped inside and introduced the girl as his daughter, Wilma. Wilma explained that she had been observing Will all day to determine whether he could feed her. She had watched all the tea, snacks, and sushi he had enjoyed, and cheerfully told Will he passed her test. She then left with Elise to look for more food. Lord Edgar apologized for his daughter's behavior. Bran commented that Wilma seemed to have hero syndrome, meaning her body continuously generated magic, making her extremely strong and giving her an enormous appetite. Ina and Elise immediately adored her, and both wanted to feed her more fatty tuna. Lord Edgar asked Will to hire Wilma as his personal guard, and even offered her as a potential bride. Will refused and explained he wanted only to continue adventuring and hunting monsters in the duchy, but that answer made Lord Edgar notice something. He turned to Duke Amadeus and asked whether he really planned to allow Will to hunt monsters freely. Duke Amadeus looked at Will and told him he had a special mission prepared for him. A few days later, Kurt was still staring at the letter reporting Will's death. The message also explained how his son could inherit the title Will supposedly left behind. Kurt laughed at his unexpected fortune until his wife suddenly screamed after seeing something outside. When Kurt looked, he found Will and his companions standing in front of him. Will, his team, and Bran sat with Kurt for a meeting. They explained that the former Duke had led an expedition into their forest 15 years earlier to search for medicinal herbs. That expedition ended in disaster. 2,000 soldiers died. Those soldiers had become zombies, and the current Duke had assigned Will the mission of purifying them. They then discussed monster management. Since the enchanted forest was under Kurt's rule, he would receive a percentage of the resources collected there. The accountant, Claw, explained that the standard share was 30%, but Kurt demanded 50%. It was unreasonable, especially after Bran told him they were willing to return any personal belongings of the fallen soldiers to the people of his territory. Herman, the second brother, tried to calm Kurt, but Kurt refused to back down. He claimed the soldiers owned very little anyway, and insisted that their funerals had already been done. Elise intervened, explaining that funerals meant nothing unless the bodies were properly purified, so she was prepared to hold the ceremonies again after the mission. Kurt mocked her, accusing her of wanting church donations. His attitude angered Erwin, who nearly struck him. Will quickly stepped in to stop the fight. The others reminded Kurt that they were here to negotiate with the Lord, not the heir. Kurt almost started another outburst, but the tension ended thanks to Wilma's loudly rumbling stomach. That night, Kurt held a private meeting with the men of his region. They were pleased that their sons and brothers would finally be purified and find peace. But Kurt insisted that Will had come only for business, not to visit family. Meanwhile, the rest of the group ate dinner at the house. Herman explained to Will that their older brother had become increasingly anxious since Will left home. Kurt had always feared that Will would return one day and take his place. Herman's wife Marlene arrived with food and scolded him for not offering drinks to Bran. Bran declined. Marlene encouraged Will in his mission, revealing that her grandfather had been one of the men who died during the expedition 15 years ago. Will promised to return any belongings of her grandfather. She thanked him and said she hoped he would one day become the heir. The group began to worry that they might be getting entangled in inheritance politics. The next day, Will's team entered the enchanted forest to begin the mission. They mocked the dead soldiers out loud. Although the zombies had limited intelligence, they understood the insult and began appearing. Elise cast a magic circle, and she and Will raised a purification barrier. When zombies crossed it, they vanished instantly. Erwin felt useless because the barrier did all the work, but Bran told them that collecting the belongings of the dead was also part of the job. They continued until most of the undead were gone. Even the former Duke appeared and was purified upon touching the barrier. Only Marlene's grandfather remained. Just as they waited, a wyvern suddenly attacked. Wilma cut it down in a single blow, and the purification magic activated. Soon after, countless dead animals appeared and began attacking. The team moved together and destroyed everything that emerged. Hours passed and exhaustion set in. Their purification magic faded. Marlene's grandfather finally appeared, but to their shock, he spoke. He had evolved into a lich. He asked about his granddaughter, and Will explained she was safe, married, and still controlling her husband. Satisfied, the lich dropped his sword and allowed Elise to purify him. After completing the mission, they returned all belongings of the dead to their families. The villagers thanked Will, but Kurt suddenly arrived to make an announcement. He ordered the villagers to hand over all armor and weapons they collected. The villagers protested. They wanted to bury the armor since they hadn't been able to bury their loved ones. Kurt insisted he needed the metal for farming tools. To satisfy both sides, Will summoned a massive block of iron and gave it to Kurt. Kurt was annoyed, but since Will would soon be gone, he left without arguing. Duke Amadeus promised Will that they would investigate and return any belongings still unclaimed. Relieved, Will thought the mission was finally over, hoping he could escape family trouble, but the Duke warned him to stay prepared. As Will and his group left, Duke Amadeus and Ruckner watched from afar, stating that their plan was still ongoing. When the team returned, the accountant asked if they wanted to attend the funeral the next day. Elise led the ceremony. The villagers grew angrier at Kurt, who didn't even attend his people's funeral. That evening, a large feast was held to honor the dead. Villagers offered Will wine, but he refused and insisted it be given to Bran, who also refused, surprising Will. Later, Kurt's wife Amelie arrived with her children to pay respects. The children admired Will and asked him to tell them stories. Ina and Louise performed a presentation of Will's past achievements, after which Will gave the children sweets he made. When the feast ended, Will met the accountant again. The accountant asked Will to become the region's new heir. Will was stunned, but the accountant insisted it was what the people wanted. They had no future under Kurt's leadership. Will said he only wanted to be an adventurer, but the village chief told him he could appoint someone like Rude to manage daily affairs. Will could still adventure while being their lord. Suddenly, Bran appeared and told Will that this was also the royal family's wish. Later that night, Bran revealed the truth of the king's plan. The king had wanted to develop the southern lands for years, but the region's rulers were weak, and the current heir, Kurt, was incompetent and short-sighted. The king couldn't force their father to retire without angering other nobles. So, instead, he planned something cleaner: send Will back home, provoke Kurt into committing a crime, and then force the father into early retirement to take responsibility. The moment the father retired, Will, now a celebrated hero loved by the villagers, would become the natural successor. Bran hadn't drunk alcohol all night to stay sharp. He knew Kurt was unpredictable. Even the massive sums of money Will had earned were no coincidence. They were preparations for funding future development of the land. The next morning, Will shared everything with his team. They were confused. Will never questioned a royal order, but it made sense when they saw him playing with his nephews. Becoming ruler would mean taking away those children's future as nobles. Unfortunately, the accountant overheard everything. That night, a crowd of villagers interrupted Will's dinner. They demanded to meet him and begged him to accept the position of heir before he left the next day. Will was shocked. He hadn't planned on leaving at all. Bran noticed the accountant spying from the bushes. He confronted him and warned him that the king hated when commoners interfered in royal strategies. The mere rumor of Will leaving soon was dangerous enough. The accountant left, but not before warning Bran about Amelie, Kurt's wife, and his warning was accurate. That same night, Amelie overheard Kurt ordering his loyal villagers to punish anyone who tried to support Will. By morning, Will still didn't know what to decide. Bran then confessed the final truth. If Will accepted the position, Kurt wouldn't just be dismissed, he'd be eliminated to prevent future conflicts. During their next meeting, Will tried once more to negotiate peacefully. He asked Kurt for a few undeveloped lands to manage and promised to help promote him and support him financially. Both brothers could rise together, and the region would thrive. But Kurt recoiled in disgust. He believed Will was trying to trick him, slowly stealing his authority piece by piece. He ordered Will to leave immediately. Outside the estate, Will met Amelie. He admitted that no matter what compromise he offered, no one would ever be satisfied. He only wanted a way forward that didn't harm anyone. But now he felt completely lost. Amelie saw the truth in his eyes. She confessed she cared about nothing except her children's safety. She had tried for years to get Will closer to them, hoping he would feel sympathy for them when the time came. Will thanked her quietly and left. Later that night, back at home, Will finally made his decision. He would accept the position, but he swore he wouldn't allow a single death, not even Kurt's. His team agreed without hesitation. The next morning they opened shops in the town. Will with spices, Louise with clothes, Ina with artisan crafts, and Erwin with weapons. The townspeople flooded the stores immediately. Kurt's followers panicked. Will's new businesses were stealing all their customers. They complained to Kurt, even asking if they could simply kill Will. Kurt refused. He knew Will was a mage. Any attempt would end in instant annihilation. When Kurt's followers returned to the village, they found themselves surrounded by Will's group. No one was hurt. On the contrary, Will offered them money and training materials to improve their shops. The gesture was enough to turn all of Kurt's men against him. Meanwhile, Will and Rude searched for safe houses for Amelie and her children, places where they would live once Kurt's downfall became public. As for Kurt, the plan was to send him to the church where his removal would look merciful rather than lethal. All Will needed now was to convince the priest. At the same time, nobles from across the region were requesting meetings with Will because Duke Amadeus and Ruckner were close to him. The lesser nobles wanted to secure favor before it was too late, but another scheme was unfolding. Rock, the noble who previously plotted against Will, handed his servant a mysterious artifact, an ancient magical item, and ordered him to deliver it to Kurt. A few days later, Kurt was furious when only one villager showed up for his meeting. Everyone else now supported Will. Even the last man admitted Will had offered him training in the capital. He quickly left, leaving Kurt completely alone. Cornered, powerless, and paranoid, Kurt finally snapped. He grabbed a knife and prepared to kill Will himself, but Rock's servant stopped him. The man explained that a knife was useless. Then he revealed the artifact, a magical relic known as the Dragon Flute. Days later, Bran sensed Kurt heading alone into the forest, where Will's team had intentionally spread rumors to lure him in. When they met, Kurt ordered Will's servants to leave. He accused Will of stealing his success and his rightful position, then revealed a magical tool, the Dragon Flute. Bran recognized the danger immediately. The flute was supposed to summon every dragon in the nearby mountains, and Will's magic alone would not be enough. Elise tried to appeal to Kurt's heart, but he no longer cared for the villagers. He claimed they had betrayed him and that he could build a new family after becoming a hero and taking Will's estate. Bran attempted to break the flute, but it did not even crack. Kurt blew into it. To his shock, no dragons appeared. Instead, dark spirits began gathering around him. Bran realized the truth. This was not the legendary dragon flute. It was the flute of evil. It absorbed the malice around it and granted its user enough strength to defeat his enemy, but at the cost of turning him into an undead monster. Kurt's body twisted into a massive spirit-bound creature, and darkness swallowed his thoughts as he fixed his glowing eyes on Will. Bran urged Will to use his holy magic immediately, insisting that Kurt was already dead. The monster attacked, and Elise blocked the first strike with a barrier, ready to sacrifice herself. Realizing there was no saving his brother, Will asked her to widen the holy field. After one last look at what remained of Kurt, Will unleashed his sacred magic. The light purified the monster, and the flute of evil dropped to the ground. At that moment, Kurt's twisted spirit flew across the kingdom. It smashed through the window of Rock's manor, where Rock had been speaking of using his son Rod against Will, and the spirit took his life. The next day, the night sealed Rock's estate. Will and Rod learned that Rock and his conspirators had all died from the spirit's attack, and the priests had purified the remains. The spirit was part of the monster Will had destroyed, but Kurt's hatred had guided it toward